Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this next episode of In a Nick of Time. We're going to get started in about 10 minutes with Gary today to talk and debunk zero trust today and what is real, what is a myth, and what is buzzwords, what is a real impact to your cybersecurity. So stay tuned. We're going to get started in about 10 minutes. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this next episode of In the Nick of Time. We're going to get started in about 5 minutes with Gary to debunk zero trust, the myth, the legend, what is real, what is not real, what is really going to impact your cyber posture. So stay tuned, it's going to be a lot of fun. In the meantime, if you have not yet subscribed to the show, do that at inthenickofTime.tv so you can be notified of the next episodes. Next week, we're going to have a comeback from our dear friend, the CTO of the United States Air Force and Space Force, Jay Bonchi, will be back on the show after his 1 year in the job to give us an update on what's been happening, what's been succeeding, and what's been struggling as well. So it's going to be a very interesting discussion next week also with Jay. So stay tuned for another 5 minutes before we get started with Gary today. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this next episode of In the Nick of Time. We're going to have a lot of fun today with Gary joining us to debunk zero trust and see what is real, what is buzzword, what is bloated, and what sticks and brings a real value to your cyber posture. So this is going to be a lot of fun. If you have questions for Gary, make sure you start asking the questions. We already have a lot of questions from the social media. So you need to start with the Q in the comment section below. If you want to share you here with us today, also do that by putting your name in the comment section as well. Wanted to remind you to subscribe to the show. We're definitely being throttled more and more on social media. So if you want to be able to be notified of the next episode, just go to inthenickoftime.tv and you're going to be able to subscribe to be notified once a week of our next episode. The next guest next week will be a great comeback from Jay Bonchi, the Air Force and Space Force CTO. We're going to have Jay back to be able to share his success and also failure about what he's been able to achieve during his first year in the job. So it's going to be very interesting as well. So if you're not subscribed, please do that at thenickofTime.tv so we have access to you without depending of notifications from LinkedIn or YouTube or Twitter. Now, wanted to remind everybody that we're going to be launching this Cloud Native Town, the world's first Cloud Native Metaverse community, completely free. And we're looking for your help to have ambassador to be able to help users and guide them in the Gather world. We're going to have companies pushing the content on there so people can be walking around and finding about the technologies. All the CNCF companies will be able to promote their content for free. And of course, we're going to have also all the Learn with Nick content and videos and events and In the Nick of Time shows on the metaverse. And we're going to do events and special events with guests and speakers, both virtually and in person as well. So make sure you check it out when we launch it. But in the meantime, if you have content that you want to post there in your company that has technology related to DevSecOps, zero trust, cybersecurity, architecture, modeling and simulation, AI, machine learning, reach out to us so we can include your video and your content on the platform for free. And also, if you have time and you want to help people not get lost into this maze of content information and be an ambassador on the platform to be able to make sure people don't do a bunch of nonsense, please also reach out to us. We're looking for about 20. I think we have about 15, so 5 more left open right now. Now, if you missed it, we have published quite a few videos in the last few weeks. 3 days or 4 days after the Uber hack, we had the Uber hack video up where we dig into what happened and how to prevent it in the future. So check that video out if you've missed it. We also then did a video on the Break Glass account because that was a key piece of what happened with Uber, and many people were asking about Break Glass accounts and what are they and how to make sure that you implement those accounts the right way so you don't get into the same struggle than Uber. So you can check that out as well. And then more recently, we published a video on the top 20 books in 2022 to check out. And I would not do a good job if I didn't remind you to take a look specifically at Joel Spaulding book, War Without Rules. That does an amazing job at describing the situation we're facing against the Chinese Communist Party. So check War Without Rules. Is really doing a very good job at showing that we are indeed in war with China. All right, so in a second, I'm going to bring up our guest, but first I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on Gary, who is joining us. He's the federal CTO for Illumio. And prior to joining Illumio, Gary was the federal chief information officer, and he also retired as the Air Force cyber operations officer with 29 years experience in military and government. He is highly technical, as you will see today, with real hands-on experiences. And of course, you'll see that he has very deep experience in managing very complex organization with multi-billion-dollar budgets and programs. And as you will see, he's a yes CIO instead of a no but or no period, I guess. So that's always good. It reminds me of Danny Holzman in the Air Force. That's the kind of senior leader we need to get things done. He successfully transitioned a 1,200 people organization to the cloud. He is a 2019 Presidential Rank Award nominee and winner of the Barry Snyder Joint Award from the Council of Inspector General for creation of oversight.gov, which was really a groundbreaking public database of reports and information from federal inspector generals. And God knows we need to have those guys be able to be more effective, and that's going to be through technology. So that's the kind of technology we need to enable the IG to do their jobs. So we're lucky to have Gary on, and I'm going to bring him up now. Hey, Gary, how are you? Good to see you.
Hi, Nick. Great seeing you again. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're so excited because apparently we're going to debunk zero trust, but it was also talking about what is real, what is bloated, what is just the buzzwords. And since zero trust really finally become the cool kid in the block, as you know, a lot of companies and a lot of teams and products obviously are starting to claim they have a silver bullet for zero trust. And it's all about buying their solution. So it's going to be an interesting discussion today with you. Before we get started, though, I always want my guests to be able to share with us a little bit of their journey. So we're going to do that now, and you can let us know a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Nick. So I grew up in Orlando, Florida. I'm a native Floridian. Lived there until went to college there. Went to UCF, go Knights. And then got my commission in the United States Air Force when I graduated college. And that was back in 92. Went off and became back then, there was no such thing as a cyberspace operations officer or career field at the time. Networks are still, computers, heck, were still relatively new, and networking was certainly new back in those days. So I started out as a communications officer doing satellite communications, radios, telephones, microwave relays, you name it, and did that for about the first half of my career, about the first 10 years. Dabbled a little bit in some networking, but again, it wasn't real mainstream back then. And then I had the opportunity to help stand up and then run the Network Operations Security Center for the Pacific. We provided network support for 10 Air Force bases, stretching from Japan to Alaska. So quite a few time zones. It was quite a challenge to get things up and running. But it was a great experience, and that kind of launched the second half of my career in the network realm, as it were. I had a great time in the military. Did 20 years. I got to be a squadron commander. Did several tours at the Pentagon, which I wouldn't recommend to anybody. But if you Nick, know as well as I do that the Pentagon can be quite challenging and can really push you to your limits sometimes. I was on the Air Force CIO staff for 4 years. Oversaw, as you mentioned earlier in your intro, multi-billion-dollar program that at the time was the program of record for doing anything IT and network related across the Air Force. That was a great experience for me. I also oversaw all network policy for the Air Force, so that was quite challenging as things are really evolving fast. And as you are well aware, getting policy processed through the Pentagon is quite an endeavor. I moved on to the Air National Guard CIO staff for my final 2 years on active duty. Spent some time pretty much doing the same thing for the Air National Guard that I had done for active duty. And then I finally decided it was time to retire. They say you know when it's time, and I knew it was time. And I was fortunate enough to get selected to be a federal CIO with the Office of the Inspector General for the United States Postal Service. That mission is something that's near and dear to my heart. You kind of touched on the ability for government to be watched, right, and look for fraud, waste, and abuse inside of government agencies. That was a great experience. Really enjoyed my time at the OIG. Spent, like I said, almost 10 years there. Had some great successes, worked with great people, and it was a great place to work. And as you mentioned, I was fortunate enough to be involved in getting oversight.gov launched, which I'm very proud of. If anyone out there is not familiar with it, I highly encourage you to go visit oversight.gov. Great resource for seeing the work of the OIGs as they watch and oversee how your tax dollars are being spent by the government. So it's a great resource, but work with a great team of people to get that up and running, and enjoyed my time at the OIG as their CIO, and then finally decided it was time for a change and moved on to become the federal CTO here at Illumio. So that's kind of my journey in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, thanks. This is quite the expertise. So we're lucky to have you today. You mentioned, a little bit about what motivated you to leave the government to go to the commercial side, but maybe you can give us a little bit of a rundown. Obviously, the Pentagon, like you said, is a kind of a special place. It's funny for me because it's been obviously quite special for I guess someone born in France to get to work in the building. At the same time, it's kind of this bunker with no device and completely disconnected from the world. I often joke that we'll be the last one to know if there is an attack on the U.S. soil because of the how disconnected the building and the rooms are from real life, and people with a notification on their phone will probably know before we do. But it's also a very unique and special place. It's interesting how when you end up leaving the government, you end up missing things you thought you didn't like at all. But it's always interesting. Life is interesting. So what led you really and pushed you? I guess obviously you had 29 years, so that's plenty of time. Much more than my 5 years in the government. So
yeah, so I honestly, it just came down to I needed a change. I was a little tired, a little burnt out from the government life. Honestly, things like government shutdowns and what's going to happen with government funding, and every year, looking at my wife and trying to explain, well, honey, there's going to be another shutdown, and I'll probably get paid. That'll be nice. Just things like that, and just working in the government. As you know, it's got its challenges, right? I mean, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of great people that work in the government, both military and the federal sector. But I mean, they're slow to change, right? I worked at a great organization that for a government agency was very agile and very quick. But even that, right? You're measuring that against other government agencies, right? So as quick and agile as we were, we still had challenges. We had funding challenges, manpower challenges, contracting challenges. You're familiar with all the normal challenges of being in government life. And it just got to a point where it was just time for a change. Things were going slow, and I just needed something different. And this whole looking to move into the private sector and have what I consider going to a IT security company in the private sector and focus back on the government, but from a different perspective, and trying to bring cutting edge technology to the government from the outside, as opposed to trying to drag it in from the inside. I decided that maybe it might be a little bit easier and a little bit more productive if I was pushing from the outside and trying to convince them that hey, there's some stuff out there that you're just not aware of, and just not taking advantage of. So that's kind of what made me decide to kind of jump out of government and go to the commercial side.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because obviously some people argue that you need to be on the inside, right, to be able to get things done. But at the same time, sometimes pushing new concepts from the outside is also very effective. I would argue, obviously, if you have the wrong people on the inside, it's going to be pretty difficult to do much from the outside. But you have more ability to get things done, and often you can be the guy, taking the ball and running. And getting it done, assuming you have the right engagement, with the government side. What have you seen so far now that you've left the government? Do you find that that kind of partnership, right, is kind of the right way to get things done?
I do, right? So I think it's key to a couple of things are key, right? Number one is you've got to coming in from the outside in with some experience and some background and understanding of what the government does. I think is critical. No offense to anyone that's never done government time, but it's one thing to hear about it. It's another thing to live through it. And you kind of touched on it, right? There's just things that you just don't understand until you've actually lived through it, right? So having that experience and coming in from the outside, having been on the inside, I think helps. And then just having those connections, right? I've got a lot of friends that are still in government, a lot of leadership inside different agencies that they understand and they're getting it, right? They're starting to understand and pay attention to things that need to be done differently, right? And just being able to find those key, like you touched on, right? Those key people, right? Having the right kinds of people in positions inside of government that, while their institutions may be a little slow to move, at least they're there, pushing, right? They're pulling while you're pushing, right? So that's if you can find those partnerships and really capitalize on those partnerships, I think it's really key. And honestly, that private public partnership is the only way the government's ever going to continue to move forward.
So obviously, when you left, you had opportunities to pretty much do whatever you wanted. You said, hey, you wanted also to continue to fight the fight and bring back value to the government. And on top of that, you went to an innovative company pushing zero trust. Which when we started pushing zero trust, I started pushing zero trust in the government about 6 years ago. People thought I was crazy pretty much and didn't believe in the concept. It's much easier now. But what really just led you to decide to focus on zero trust versus AI, machine learning, or some fancy IT capability elsewhere?
So, like you said, right? So, zero trust has been around for a while, right? It's not something new that just started, when the president released his executive order. But it's kind of at a prime time for the government, right? They're starting to pay attention to it. They're starting to understand some of the principal foundational things of zero trust. And I've always been really interested in how do you provide security in a impactful way, but not an impactful way to your customer necessarily, right? How can you secure things without shutting things down? And zero trust really kind of, if it's done properly, right, it can really kind of get probably the closest that we've gotten in generations of trying to get the right amount of security applied in the right place at the right time, without being so overburdening that people can't get their jobs done. So I had kind of decided that seemed like it was a good fit for me. I've always been a 80% is good enough kind of guy. And I think zero trust is a lot about, you apply security, but you have to, you're understanding the fact that it's not a zero sum game, that you're not going to prevent all breaches, that you're going to try to do your best to prevent breaches, but then you're going to really get down and deal with breaches when they happen. And that spoke to the practical side of who I am, which is not trying to live in some fantasy land where, all our networks are going to be, secure against all breaches and all attacks. And we can sleep easy at night because there'll never be another breach, for the rest of our tenures, which is just fallacy. And I know there are some people out there that believe that. I am not one of those guys. So zero trust, just kind of spoke to me from that perspective, to be honest with you.
So are you telling me I was lied to? People lied to me, and that wasn't true. I'm very disappointed. No silver bullet.
No silver bullet. I know it's hard to believe, but there's no such thing as a silver bullet, right? So I think that only exists in horror movies with werewolves. I think that's the only place silver bullets really work.
Yeah, no doubt. So I guess that was the reason why also I found it interesting, right? That suddenly what used to be really a fight for me to push zero trust into the government became, kind of a must do, thanks to a few new appointed executives, right, from the White House and CISA, finally pushing zero trust to the masses and writing, and I helped participated in the writing of that memo, executive order for the zero trust software bill of material push. So I guess that was just interesting and funny to me how overnight, right, people that I used to fight to convince to embrace zero trust became expert of zero trust overnight, and then were selected, right, to lead in the DoD the implementation of zero trust, despite quite honestly knowing very little about it, and pretty much fighting me the whole time when I was deploying the Air Force and Space Force zero trust implementation of zero trust, called the CNAP, and kind of fighting that fight. I actually it was easier to deploy zero trust than getting it approved and convincing the people to get it approved. Although we did it in 45 days, so if we can do that, you can probably do pretty much anything in life. So obviously that's interesting, but what is really misunderstood, right, when it comes to zero trust? I feel like when you read this zero trust document, it's so bloated that effectively it almost sounds like everything cyber related is now labeled zero trust. I feel like it's bloated. It's effectively every piece of your cyber poster is your zero trust architecture, which really means you will never be able to get it implemented because it's a never-ending journey of improvements and learning and maturity. So what do you think is really misunderstood when it comes to zero trust?
I think there's a couple of things, right? You touched on one of them, which is that anything that has ones and zeros somehow is related to zero trust, right? And that misunderstanding of what are really the core principles of zero trust, as opposed to hey, let's just slap the zero trust label on anything that we're trying to sell, anything that we're trying to deploy, because that's the current words that people seem to recognize and are resonating with some leadership. And I think the next to that, the next biggest thing is, there's no such thing as a zero trust solution, right? There's no, I don't care who the vendor is, right? Anybody that tells you we've got it, right? Here it is in a box, right? Here's a download. If you just install this, if you'll just do this one thing that we're telling you to do, you're going to have zero trust. You can check that box forever and sleep easy at night. Zero trust is not, it's just not a single product, right? It's about a mindset, the way that you're approaching things, the way that you're dealing with things. And then it's a complement of technologies, right? There's the people have a tendency to focus on a singular solution. In the world of zero trust, that's just ridiculous. And when you look at the complexity of today's enterprises, multi-cloud, hybrid, virtual, physical, end devices, IoT, OT devices. I mean, it's insane to think that there's anybody out there that has developed a solution that's going to provide a true zero trust solution for something that encompassing. That's insane, right? So I think that's another mistake that people make, is thinking that that there's a magic bullet out there, as you said before, right? But there's a magic solution out there that they can just stroke a check, pay some system integrator to come in, install a tool, and you get to check that zero trust box. I think that's crazy to think that you can do that.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I'm going to go on my soapbox a tiny bit here, because I was a little bit frustrated when the DoD finally embraced zero trust, but yet decided not to reuse the existing work we've done with really what is the largest implementation of zero trust out there with the cloud native access point, and then you would see this right, starting a whole new engagement from scratch. Initially saying, hey, we're just gonna do this proof of concept, right, to compare and have options, which it makes a lot of sense, right, to have options in an organization as large as the DoD, right? So that made some sense, and they say, hey, we're going to do an MVP for 6 months, which was already much longer than the CNAP production ready capability, which was again 45 days. It was also much more money because CNAP only cost $2 million, so that's what it is. But it's good to have options, so I understood. But then you see, right, the government have biased requirements, right? For example, what I found interesting is the fact that the first initial bid, and you're going to tell me what you think, because I think that directly compete with what you guys do at Illumio. But effectively, the first bid was really pushing a product, a solution that was accredited at the time for impact level 4, which was incapable of going to classified environments and would use the control plane of a company. In fact, the product I'm going to name is Zscaler, right? So Zscaler, at least I felt like Zscaler was doing a very good job at lobbying their products, since Zscaler at the time was accredited impact level 4. Their whole control plane of zero trust was running as a service on the Zscaler cloud. And for me, it was a non-starter. When I compared Zscaler to other solutions that we ended up picking at the time with the Air Force and Space Force engagement, one of the key requirements was, hey, we need to be able to run the same stack with no drift across all classification levels all the way to SAP. So being able to work air gap was a must, and I would argue it completely is nonsense to even consider using any product that's not able to do that from day one, since most of the meaningful mission work is happening on the classified side. And so, I was a little surprised when I saw the bid coming out of this as saying that the requirement would only be at impact level 4, which just happened to be, these killer limitations, right? And so then you see them starting a proof of concept, right, with Booz Allen getting an award, all to wait 6 months and then, tell us, hey, we learned a lot during this pilot, although we did not deploy anything in production. So I don't know how you learn by not doing anything in production. And then they said, well, we really think that being able to do things on the classified side is a must. And so they changed the requirement, right? And say, well, secret will be really the minimum. I'm like, yeah, probably, and so they updated the requirement really after, Booz actually failed to deliver their MVP after 6 months, which, by the way, it's interesting, right? Because all the bidders were saying we probably cannot do it in 6 months. We probably need 8 or 9 months, right? And so they got passed on because they couldn't do it in 6 months. They gave it to Booz, who said, hey, we can't do it in 6 months. Then they couldn't. But instead of saying we just failed, they said, well, we're going to change the requirement and make it so, secret is now a requirement. So we're going to get more time. And oh, by the way, we're not going to just get another 6 months. We're going to get another 18 months. So now you're looking at 2 years. So what started, right, with me pushing back at this whole engagement as a 6 months MVP to compare and give options to the department between the CNAP that was already in production, by the way, all the way to SAP at the time when they decided to do this, to, hey, we're going to do a 6 months MVP with Booz. Now is a 2-year engagement after I'm gone. Obviously, no one is pushing back anymore, so they can go back to doing all this nonsense. Maybe the IG should be looking at this, I guess. Maybe we can use your website. But really, that just tells me, right, there's also this kind of conflict of interest, right, between the government and some companies. But then, it's almost like when we fail at delivering value and end up wasting quite a bit of taxpayer money, there's really no consequence, right? And so people just end up moving on, and like nothing happened. But I guess I don't have a specific question for you on this. I don't want to put you on the spot with this one. I just want to give a little bit of context to the audience as far as what's going on right now in the department. So now this side is actually working this MVP that's now turned into a 2-year nonsense. With a single prime, that's also the big difference with the cloud native access point engagement with the Air Force. We had 9 companies on contract. The integrator is the government. We have talent in there to be able to make sure that we act as the orchestrator of the show, right? And I think that's very important. I don't know what you think, but I really think that for some reason we taught acquisition teams and really all government officials to delegate everything to the contractors, to the point where we don't even have expertise in assessing products and technology often to the right degree of competence. I don't know what you feel about what is the right level of skills and how helpful or not helpful would it be to have in the government that expertise to at least make sure that we're buying the right things, we have the right requirements in place that are agile and not stuck in time and able to evolve with the technology pace, but also making sure that we're held accountable when it comes to the timelines.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of key things you mentioned there, Nick. So I think that the biggest one is that whole skill set, right? When you look at the federal government, when you look at the DoD, trying to secure the right skill sets, the right people with the right backgrounds, and then trying to keep them, right, and trying to maintain them. That's, I think, one of the biggest challenges that both the federal government and the DoD face, especially when we're living in a world where there are so many cyber jobs available out in the private sector that pay so much better, right? With a lot less downside, right? So much more upside, right? So trying to figure out, for the federal government and the military to figure out how do they get those skill sets, how do they retain them, right? And I think sometimes both the federal government and the military sometimes focus maybe a little too much on, and not that it's not important, right? But sometimes they focus on the person that's going to have their hands on the keyboard, as opposed to the person that's going to be sitting in a room, drawn on the dry erase board, right? Or making the decisions, right? And having the background and the experience to understand, the needs versus, what can be done and what needs to be done, the prioritization, and, from that leadership perspective, right? And one of the things I think that and I'll speak specifically to the military because it's a little bit different for the federal government, but for the military, right? Those people have to be grown for the most part, right? I mean, they do try to bring in, some civilians, but for the most part, the people in uniform, they have to be grown, right? You don't hire a 10-year captain or a 20-year colonel, right? You have to grow a 10-year captain or a 20-year colonel. And by the time people get to some of those levels in their career field, they've decided that, hey, I'm done. I mean, I'm a perfect example. I did 20 years and decided, even though I had a path in front of me to stay in the Air Force much longer, I just decided that I was ready for a change and there was something different. And that my skill set was in high demand at the time, and I had a chance to go capitalize on that skill set. So I think that's something that sometimes people lose sight of, is the fact that they're in a very challenging environment trying to recruit and retain those skill sets, especially given today's world. Now, that doesn't necessarily excuse the whole, you hear it all the time, right? The not invented here syndrome, right? As much as we talk about joint fights and doing things together, right? You saw it, you've seen it. It's rampant in the government that, hey, everything has to be a new idea originated here, right? A lot of people don't want to share on someone else's work and just say, hey, I'm just going to capitalize on that. Which I think is unfortunate, right? And I think sometimes that may come down to, how are people recognized and how are they rewarded? Are they rewarded more for what appears to be an original idea, or are they rewarded more for capitalizing on someone else's idea and maybe improving on it, right? I'm not sure that the government necessarily promotes that as well as it should. I've worked with this a lot in my career. This is in a unique situation, right? They're trying to appease a lot of masters with all the different services and all their different requirements. And then, you've got each of the services saying not invented here, right? Thanks, DISA. We're going to do it our way. And DISA's trying to write the most broadest solution, right? So I don't envy the position they're in. I can certainly understand the challenges that they face. But at the end of the day, right, if we're gonna succeed, we got to figure out, different ways of doing business. And I think capitalizing on the work that others have done. I'm obviously a little bit biased about CNAP, having come from the Air Force and having worked with, the CNAP program office. But I mean, that's a great example of some outside the box thinking that the Air Force is capitalizing on, right? I do wish that other people would be a little more involved in just sharing things and accepting that share, right? So I don't know. I will tell you, Nick, after 20 years in uniform and then, another 10 years in government, I've been watching it for almost 30 years. It kind of ebbs and flows, but at the end of the day, I think that we can do better, right? I really think that we can do better. We just got to keep pushing and pushing to try to get our government to do better for us.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because for me, it's pretty new, I guess, to me, and to people like you, I guess you've seen this for years. So I guess you're kind of maybe a little bit jaded about seeing this happen again and again, right? And I'm sure you probably have 20 examples or 200 examples of the same situation that you've seen and witnessed about, the silos, the egos, the incompetence, all of the above, whatever the case may be. And it's I agree that with you that it is tough to pick between all the services. When I was selected to go and help the Joint Staff as the first CSO over there, alongside the Space Force and Air Force, and the ABMS Jet C2 nightmare. Obviously, you deal with every services and the mission partners and all the nations, and that's actually pretty interesting. But what I found is I think that's a good excuse, right? That this I could use. But the fact is, when you start leading and delivering actual warfighter value and stuff that they can use and touch in production in real use case, not in a lab, but in a real production environment with real data and stuff, I think at that point, people start to see the value and jump on board, right? And that's what we've done with CNAP, right? And look at CNAP, sure, I'm obviously biased. I created it with the team, and we had help from so many teams, and including you guys and many others. And that's the thing, we were a very diverse team, right? That's the other thing that you even see with Platform One, right? it's not just one company or one product. We have dozens of capabilities. So by picking platform one, you're not picking Red Hat or VMware or Amazon or Azure. You have the options of diversity, and that's how you have a good enterprise service. I would argue that often, when you go with a big prime and one company, you end up not having the diversity of choice because the government is not pushing for mitigating that issue. And honestly, I think that's why both Platform One and CNAP have succeeded massively, is because of the diversity of options. When you look at what's misunderstood, with zero trust, I remember people, not really understanding the concept of zero trust. The name can be seen as confusing. What is kind of the biggest complaint you get from leadership when you go and talk about zero trust? Do they feel like they're gonna get naked in with no perimeter and everybody is gonna be able to get it? What's the biggest complaint you hear from people?
So it's interesting, right? I think that the biggest complaint that I hear from people is that they look at these different zero trust architectures, right? And they go, there's so much here we have to do, right? And we have so many, so few limited resources, and then they're trying to figure out how do they get. A lot of them are trying to just figure out how to get started, right? And where I've got limited resources, where's my biggest bang for the buck? The challenge with that is so many people oftentimes look at these architectures and they think that they've got to deploy these things, step one, then step two, then step three, and invariably they want to start at the outside perimeter and they want to start with identity, and they say, hey, as soon as we get these nailed down, then we'll move on to some of the other aspects of zero trust that I think get a little bit closer to the heart of what zero trust is really intended to address. Things like assume breach, contain breach, don't trust anybody. But they get so, I think, so overwhelmed with what zero trust is, right? And the fact that the smart ones know they can't just buy a solution, and they're looking at this whole array of solutions that they're going to have to deploy if they really want to have a true zero trust architecture inside their agency. I think they just get a little overwhelmed, and trying to pick a place to start and understanding that you can do some of these things in parallel. And again, going back to what I said earlier, that sometimes 80% is good enough. How long, Nick, you've been around for a while, how long we've been trying to nail down identity, right? If we could just get identity 100% perfect, we always know that it's Nick that's logging into the network and we can trust Nick, then we don't have to worry about anything else that happens because we trust Nick. But we've seen, even if we could make that happen, which you and I both know we can't, right? We just can't get identity 100%. It's just never going to happen. At least not in my lifetime. I don't expect it to happen. But here's a problem, right? So let's pretend that we got that 100% right. Okay, well then what happens if Gary decides that he's gonna steal stuff and sell it to the Chinese? You trusted me, but I'm still inside your network. And we just, I think people just get fixated on the things that they really understand, at least because it's been around for so long. So identity, perimeters, right? Those are the things that they've been talking for so long. It's so easy to just fall right back to that. So I think that's one of the biggest things I've seen is just sometimes when you go in and start talking about flipping the model on its head and approaching zero trust from a different angle, I think just there are some agencies out there that struggle with that a little bit.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's such a big, complex change, right? That most people, and honestly, the fact that all these publications are so bloated with requirements when it comes to explaining what zero trust is, starting to tie back to the seams and souls and the loop cycle of decision making, and which I'm not saying that they don't have a piece of the puzzle of your cyber posture and your ability to be secure. But if everything becomes zero trust, and you effectively say to people, hey, you have to completely rethink your entire cyber defense, and the term for it is going to be zero trust, where already zero trust is a piece of your cyber defense. There are other things that get bolted on or added on or baked in ideally, but it depends on the use case. And then that becomes your cyber posture. But I, when I read the DISA zero trust guide or whatever the name is, my comment back to the team was, first, it's too long, and then it's bloated, and you have too many pieces, and you added data centricity, you added, seems so, feedback loops, which I'm not saying is not part of your cyber defense. It's just now, if that's, the foundation of zero trust, then you effectively say zero trust equal cyber defense. And now you're putting the bar so high that most teams are not going to be able to do it. So how do you limit, right? What is zero trust, right? At some point someone has to say, hey, this is what it is, right? And this is where it starts and stops, and the rest is added, cyber defense capabilities to it.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question, right? And I think a lot of people approach it differently, like you said, right? Some people just want to put an equal sign between zero trust and cyber defense, and I'm with you. I think that's insane, right? I think it's ridiculous to think that you can do that, right? I think that when I'm talking to people about what really is zero trust, and I tell them, look, I'm not telling you to give up on identity. I'm not telling you to give up on perimeter defenses, because they do have their place, right? And there are things that instances where those are critical, right? And you need to do those things, right? But from my perspective, right, the way that we look at it from where I work now is trying to explain to people, you've got to assume you're going to be breached. Now what, right? To me, that gets the heart of zero trust. Is you assume that breach. Now when you say, oh my gosh, we've been breached, here are the impacts, here's what's going to happen inside my enterprise. Now, to me, you're starting to get down to zero trust of now that someone's inside the wire, now that someone's trying to run rampant through our network, what are we doing about it? And to me, that's where you start really getting to the heart and soul of zero trust. Is somebody's inside the wire, they're starting to move throughout your enterprise, they're trying to go after your data. What are you doing about it from when they're inside, right? And what are you doing when you assume that either it's someone that's not supposed to be there, or it's someone that is supposed to be there, but they're doing something they're not supposed to be doing? What are you doing about that? And when you start to get to the core of those questions and how you're going to answer those questions, to me, that's when you're really getting to the heart of what zero trust is about.
Yeah, no doubt. That's spot on. So, when you look at how the U.S. government is embracing zero trust today, what's happening? What do you see? Obviously, you've seen the White House executive order from the president. You see CISA and OMB pushing for zero trust, although it's mostly an unfunded mandate right now, as always. But that, I still argue that there's plenty of money out there. We just need to stop wasting it. But that's a different problem. People always want more government, more money, but I can tell you we got plenty, and we just need to be better at spending it. But that's a different part. But what do you see is happening? I'm sure you have engagements pretty much with both the DoD side, the IC, the IC, and the .gov side of the house. How is it going?
Yeah, so I think that things are. I think the ball's starting to get rolling, right? When it comes to how it is, right, with the government, right? That the boulder that people are pushing is a big boulder, and they're always pushing it uphill. But I think that people are starting to make some progress. I mean, you touched on just having a presidential directive and some of the things coming out of CISA. That my former role as a CIO, right? It's one thing if I walk in and I'm trying to make a pitch to get some money to go do something, and my fellow executives are looking at me, the head of the agency is looking at me going, okay, this is another great idea that Gary's come up with. It's different when I can point to other things and go, hey, look, this is coming out of the White House, this is coming out of CISA, right? This is something that has got national level attention. So it's not just me going, hey, I read this on an in-flight magazine on my last trip. These are really serious issues and critical things that we can point to, right? So I think that those were very foundational, right? But as you said, right, unfunded mandates, right, and trying to find the money to fund these things is a different conversation. I think one thing of interest that I found was CISA in their strategic plan, their very first objective that I think it was 1.1 talked about withstanding attacks and recovering from attacks. It wasn't about preventing attacks, right? It was fighting, essentially what in the military we always talk about, fighting through the attack, right? And how do you deal with an attack and how do you recover from attack, as opposed to then the next objective was actually talking about preventing attacks, right? That's a change in mindset, right? And I think that's that's where things start when it comes to the government, is a change in mindset and an understanding that they have to start thinking about things differently. Which is a very hard thing to accomplish. You're well familiar that it's a very hard thing to change the mindset of the government, of sometimes of senior military leaders. But I think that those things are really starting to pick up steam. I mean, CNAP, right? CNAP's a good example of the military, the Air Force specifically and Space Force, willing to take a different approach to things, right? And understand that they had to think about things differently. I think that they're slowly getting there, right? And I know that this has had some challenges, right? But they're evolving, right? They're working through their iterations of things that they need to work through at their pace. But even they are starting to make a little bit of progress, and they're starting to push that boulder a little further up that hill. I think that one of the biggest things that is still lacking, and we touched on a little bit, right, is that skill set, right? And how do you track people that are going to be able to do this, right, and are going to be able to think differently?
Oh, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, sorry about that. I thought I froze up on you.
No.
So being able to think about how do we attract the skill sets that are needed in the government. I think that is so critical in trying to figure that out and trying to understand how we're going to attract skill sets. And I think that there's still some wiggle room there for some creative approaches so that everyone can attract those types of skill sets. And then fixing some of the procurement problems. You and I are both very aware of the fact that procurement is a serious issue in the government and in the military. And until they fix some of those procurement problems, they're still going to have trouble embracing some of this new technology.
Yeah, that the talent, and I think we just lost him. Yep, we just lost him. So let's wait a couple of seconds for him to come back. If anyone, by the way, has questions, make sure you start asking the questions on the comment section below. We have quite a few questions for Gary, so if we want to have some time for questions at the end, please start asking now, because we're probably not going to have a lot of time with Gary after this. So anyone has questions in the meantime, I'm happy to take them, but Gary is going to probably come back in a second. So there we go. Gary's coming back.
My apologies. I don't know.
No, this time we actually lost you. That's okay. There's always we had issues a few times this the last couple of weeks with StreamYard. I don't know what's going on, but that's okay.
Sorry about
that. That's not your fault. So you give us your good feedback when it comes to the engagement with the CIOs and the different agencies, and you mentioned something interesting, right, which was the fact that you were saying, hey, because this is coming finally from the White House and CISA, you have top cover, right, as a CIO to go to the agency and ask for money or getting it done, but I would argue, obviously, this Monday came probably 5 years too late, in my opinion. So how do we innovate as CIOs and keep up with the commercial pace, right? Because when I pushed at DHS, we designed cyber.gov back, 5.5 years ago, maybe 6 now. And we actually had Zero Trust as a foundation of the architecture, yet, at the time, NPPD director didn't believe in Zero Trust and decided not to engage in the Zero Trust implementation. Then he became the director of CISA and did a whole bunch of nothing, and spent more money on Parameter and Einstein and all that good stuff. So, I guess, if as CIOs we have to wait for one guy or the White House to wake up, usually that happens when really the writings are on the wall and it's already probably too late. So how do we balance that, right, with the pace of IT that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's, I wish I could solve that. If I could solve that, I'd be a rich man. Simply because because that's an age-old problem with how do you get the government to speed up its processes, and how do you get them to get past some of the hangups that they have. I think that there's got to be a couple things, right? I have been encouraged by the willingness of the government to at least sit down and have conversations, right? To sit down and talk about some of these things, right? And sure, talk is cheap, I get it, right? But until they start talking, right, and understand what's going on, in the private sector, and how things, how fast things are moving and what the real threats are, until they start to formulate those ideas, they're obviously not going to take any action. so that free exchange of ideas, right, is where it starts. And then you've always got some people inside the government that are the leaders, right? That are pushing the boundaries, that are trying to be cutting edge a little bit. But the reality is the federal government and the military are always going to lag, right? And significantly in many aspects, right? I've lamented for years the cycle from an IT perspective, right? And the fact that you look at the budgeting and the procurement cycles of the federal government, right? It's insane. The federal government, right? They submitted their budget for 23, which hasn't been passed yet, but they submitted their 23 budget a year ago, right? I mean, the amount of time that they have to forecast when they're trying to budget things, and the lack of flexibility that they have for the way that they need to spend money and the way that they need to go procure IT. I'll be honest with you. I think until there's pressure put on Congress to take some of the shackles off that the federal laws have in place right now that are hindering the federal government and the military from being able to really accelerate and really progress. I don't know how that changes, right? Maybe we need to get younger people in Congress that have a different mindset, right? That understand that the world of TikTok and social media and threats online and hacks and ransomware, and really understand and appreciate those things. It's one thing to get them in the federal government to be doing it. I think it's another thing to get them into positions where they're actually able to pass some legislation that again, take the shackles off some of the government employees. Because I think that's one of the biggest challenges that both the government and the military face is just some of those restrictions that are placed on them, right? They can only be flexible so much, right? They're kind of placed in a legislative box. They got to follow all these rules and regulations and procurement guidelines and everything else that private companies don't have to abide by necessarily. So I think that honestly, if I could wave a magic wand, I'd change Congress, right? I would change the people that are putting these shackles on government and on the DoD.
Yeah, term limits maybe will be a good first step, right? I think everybody agrees, but they're never going to pass it. But obviously, most of Congress probably doesn't know how to turn on their cell phone, so let alone understand the challenges you're talking about here. So that makes a lot of sense that they couldn't fix it, and you're limited by what you have. And it's funny with 340 million people, we didn't find better to come and help us, run this Congress. It's just a little bit mind-boggling sometimes. But
I encourage the staffers, right? Because the congressmen rely on their staffers, right? We need to encourage staffers, to get involved, right? Because I think that's a way to get to some of the legislative change that's so desperately needed.
Yeah, and you mentioned the 1 year, but really at the end of the day, I remember we were working when I left on the 2029 budget at the time a year ago when I left. So
yep.
Really, yes, sure, we're doing the 1 year budget, but that's really for like barely swapping anything. But really, it's more like a 5-year cycle, and that's just mind-boggling to me. It should be a pretty broad bucket, right? And then with a lot of flexibility down to the year of execution. But that's often not the case with very precise PEs and money assigned into very precise buckets. Despite more urgency or need of the money going elsewhere, you can obviously shuffle that. It's very challenging to anyone claiming they know what they're gonna need to buy in 2029 in IT is probably either a genius or wrong. So I don't know, right?
Yeah, and my money's on wrong, right? Like I said, I'm trying to budget across.
Well, lucky. I guess you could be lucky, but. Usually we're not lucky somehow, right? It's what it is. So
somehow we're never lucky when we're doing that.
So you talked about, obviously in the CNAP, in fact, we did not get rid of the parameter security. I did not believe that was, something we should do. And often people assume that, when you move to zero trust, you completely get rid of parameter security. What's your take on the parameter side?
I'll tell you, it's as many sleepless nights as I had as a result of firewall issues. If I could get rid of firewalls tomorrow, I'd be the happiest man on the planet. But the reality is that's not going to happen, right? I mean, you've got to have a perimeter, right? It's not And that's where I always worry, right? Some people go, oh, so, based on, if you're talking about, assume breach, then just give up on perimeter, right? And I don't think you can do that, right? I think you recognize the fact that you've got to have perimeter, right? But I think here's the difference, right? I think that perimeters need to be defined for very specific things, right? And not right now today, perimeters are supposed to do everything, right? The perimeter is supposed to be so thick, right, and so involved in so much stuff, right? And there are people that want to say, hey, firewalls are great devices, so let me U-turn all my internal traffic through a firewall, right, to do inspection and to do segmentation, network segmentation. I mean, that's insanity, right? To think that you're going to have all your traffic, U-turning through a perimeter. And yet there are some people out there that think that that's a logical approach to doing this, right? So do I think you can really get completely rid of perimeter security? No. And as you and I both know, right, there's some very specialized boxes that you can place at your perimeter that can have some very serious, impact on your security's posture of an enterprise. But thinking that security perimeter is where you should be putting all your eggs, which there are so many agencies that put all their eggs in perimeter security. I think that's a huge flaw if that's your approach, right? If you really want to get serious about security, right, having a perimeter is great, but you need to get down to the smallest common denominator, right? Get down to your apps, get down to your data. That's where your security really needs to be heavy, because that's where the breaches are occurring, right? They always find a way to get through the firewall. They always find a way to get through the VPN, right? And they get inside the wire again, right? I'm not saying that you don't have to have a perimeter, but man, so many people just think that that's all that's necessary. I think that's a fallacy that people are making huge mistakes when they think that that's what they have to do. Just like I think it's a mistake to think that you can just rip it all out and you don't need anything on the perimeter. I think that's getting a little far out there for my personal taste.
Yeah, no doubt. And like you said, it also doesn't mean you get rid of the perimeter either. But microsegmentation, right, is kind of the answer there, and the ability for the malicious actor to laterally move to your crown jewel and limiting access even to the insider threat person to only what they're supposed to have access to and see, obviously is part of the answer. And then, when you start looking at the perimeter piece, well, obviously the perimeter is rapidly changing with, people working from home. Obviously now you're going to start thinking their network is part of your network. You're going to start also thinking of, obviously your cloud services, your IoT devices, what is on what network. When you go to the edge, you're compounding the problem. When you add mobile devices, tablets, you add to that. So effectively, the building that you use to protect is now decentralized. I think that's what people need to understand, really. I think that's what it is, right? So now you have to protect things that are completely decentralized and going to be stored on different devices, different cloud providers, different edge device. So now, obviously data centricity becomes a piece of that. Strong identities, of course, is a piece of that. But then also the micro segmentation down to the smallest, cut possible, so you can limit what people get to see, what people get to be aware of, right? And the ability to laterally move to those systems, that's probably the biggest win. And so when you obviously look at that, it doesn't mean you get rid of that parameter. But then, obviously everybody says, well, identity, right, is kind of the main pillar, which is probably true to some degree, right? But like you said, identities are not perfect, but you're dealing with both, people identities and system identities with non-person entities, right? So what about it? What do you pay attention to, knowing that identities are not perfect, but what is something that you want to be able to see in a cyber defense capability to say, hey, you're doing enough to at least have the basics that are needed to at least have that identity pillar in place.
Right. So I mean, obviously, right, you've got to have some sense of authentication, right? And it's got to be some sense of somewhat beyond just a basic username password, right? I mean, I think that everyone has finally acknowledged that a simple username password just isn't cutting it. We tried the whole complexity thing. Hey, it's got to be 64 digits long, and you can't repeat a character, and you can have special characters. And I think we finally have accepted the fact that that had the opposite effect, because people just started reusing passwords and writing them down. So there goes your security of your passwords. So having some semblance of some secure authentication, I think, is very critical. But then you have to start asking yourself, okay, so if I can have some semblance of assurance of who this person is, but maybe not, right? Now you gotta start focusing on, what are you granting people access to, right? Whether it's I say people, right? What are you granting access to, and under what conditions, right? So there's some of that conditional access, and asking yourself, what device are they coming from geographically, right? One of the simplest things drives me crazy when you read about a breach, and you go, oh yeah, the person was sitting in overseas in some country, and you're like, do you have any employees in that country? Well, no. But a very simple thing would have been to not allow somebody to log in from that country, don't you think? Some of those basic things, those basic tenets that I think that people often just don't get around to because they're so fixated on, again, trying to solve this perfect identity problem.
And no alerting too, right? That's the other piece. Also, they could have, at least, even if they didn't block it, at least they could have been alerted, and there was nothing.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. And I think that, people are so afraid of blocking access, right? That false positive. Look, accept the fact that you're gonna block. Sometimes you're gonna block into a legitimate request. But if that's in a very small percentage of your blocks, what's in the grand scheme of things, right? What's the greater evil? Stopping that one person that maybe for some reason popped up on the radar and you blocked them, but they had a legitimate reason, versus the 15 times somebody didn't have a legitimate reason. You went, I'm not sure, so I'm just going to let them pass. I think that's a significant problem. But then carrying that identity throughout your enterprise, right? So many people go, they're in. And again, I'm back to the whole, once you're inside the wire, right? All checks and balances are off, and people start running amok inside the enterprise. Being able to carry that identity and being able to use that identity throughout. But again, not trusting it 100%, right? That's why you touched on microsegmentation. Such a fan of microsegmentation because, I can control where you're going. We can lock you down to the things that you're trying to get to. And the second you try to deviate from those trusted paths that we're allowing based on who you claim to be, which isn't always the case, but the second you try to deviate from one of those trusted paths, that's when you should be blocked. That's when you should be stopped. So I don't think that identity needs to be abandoned, just like perimeter security. I don't think we need to abandon this hope of trying to solidify identity, but we have to understand its limitations. And I think so many people don't take into account those limitations when they're designing the defense of their enterprise. I think that's a serious fallacy that people need to get past.
Yeah, no doubt. And I guess that's what I use for my device. YubiKeys, right? And I like the fact that you have to push the button physically, right, to be able to log in after you type your PIN. I think that's pretty cool, and you can put it on your device, your even mobile, if you want to do that. It's actually pretty cool. So obviously no silver bullet on identity, but it's still an important piece of the puzzle. The other thing that I've witnessed is, that's something that I really pushed against, was ignoring the device state. I've seen many companies push their proxy identity thing to say that's zero trust and all you need is that, and you can just use me as a proxy, and now you can authenticate to your application and you have zero trust, but completely ignoring the endpoint and the device being used by those people. And obviously, if you have a malware on your device and someone is keylogging everything you do, or taking screenshot or whatever it is they're doing on your device, that's probably pretty bad to let them have access to your system. So what do you think about when you think of endpoints? And, we call that comply to connect in the department, obviously, but, whatever we want to call this kind of endpoint security aspect of things.
Yeah, so I think that we have spent I say we, right? In the entire realm of cyber professionals, spent so many years trying to kind of going back to that 100% solution for an endpoint and saying, I'm just going to keep all viruses off my endpoint, right? I'm going to keep all illegitimate users off an endpoint. I'm going to invest all this time and energy and money in trying to stop somehow something malicious from an endpoint that they lost focus of. There's the potential of that always happening. Now what, right? Again, back to the breach has occurred. What are you doing to limit that breach, right? Checking device state, right? The whole comply to connect. Again, going back to geographic location of where is that device located, right? Has the associated a user with a device? Has the user always used a Mac and all of a sudden they're coming on a Windows machine or vice versa, right? Not necessarily in of itself a problem, but a potential flag that somebody should at least make some assessment of and decide, hey, maybe we need to treat this slightly different until we can validate what's going on here. There are so many different ways that you can associate endpoints and look at the, beyond just the, is the antivirus up to date on the endpoint, right? Do we think that it's been compromised somehow by a virus? There are so many different ways that we can factor in that endpoint security in a true zero trust architecture and tie it into this whole idea of assuming breach, trying to lock those things down, but then assuming a potential breach of that endpoint. Now what, right? And bringing that into that whole zero trust conversation. I think so many people assume that zero trust is only about the data centers, right? And when we talk about zero trust, it's about entering into the enterprise, getting into your data center, getting into your applications, and they forget where people are originating from in the first place. And I think it's overlooked sometimes when they have the zero trust conversation. I think that's one of the few places where people go, oh, that's IT security, right? That's the normal, the old stuff. We're talking zero trust here. And I think that's a mistake, right? Just as it's a mistake to say, oh, everything's zero trust. I think it's really a critical mistake to leave out endpoints when you're having that zero trust conversation, trying to design your zero trust architecture.
Yeah, when for me, it's really a pillar of zero trust when you start thinking of the endpoint being used. We in the CNAP from day one, we started to look at not only the antivirus and endpoint protection solution being used on the device, but also assigning a device identity with a key, right, assigned to the device, so we know exactly the device and who is it assigned to, and tracking that, like you mentioned, and then looking also of some of the hardening required from different impact levels in DoD, for example. So based on that configuration of the device, you would only get access to L2, L4, L5, resources and so on. And we even started to do this, on the higher classification side, to be able to say, hey, that device is not meant to be used on SIPR. You can't do that, right? So it's just interesting how you could flatten the network, right? And through different type of verifications, microsegment access to resources and data based on that data centricity and need to know and zero trust concept. So it's actually a pretty big foundational piece of zero trust when you look at the endpoint being used. And of course, people now, jump on the bring on device wagon because the government made it, those government devices are so hardened and became bricks that no one wants to use them. And now they want to use their personal device to get access to resources. But that's also a pretty scary use case, because now you have less visibility on the device if you don't use any type of agent or MDM. And then, on top of it, what people, I think, failed to realize, and I think it's actually going to become a real problem, is the day there is a breach or the day there is a leak and there's maybe a classified document being shared on Nipper by accident or whatever the case may be, and someone comes and sees your personal laptop on your MacBook or whatever it is you use and take it away, and the government tells you, we're not going to pay back for it and we have to destroy it, so it's gone. I think people are going to be pretty upset about that. So I don't know what your take is. Your take is on bring on device. And I get the flexibility, I get the vision, but I'm worried that it's really opening a massive liability to the warfighter and the airmen and the DoD employees, instead of the government coming up with a solution that would be less stringent to secure their devices, so we can use that instead of. I hate the idea of using my personal device. In fact, I never did that. I always stuck to the government device because I don't like the mistake that I could make, right, by swapping or going between my two hats, my personal life and my government life. I don't like swapping my hats on the same device. What's your take on that?
I'm personally with you, right? I think there are a lot of savvy users out there that are getting to the point where they're starting to recognize that. That's been a topic of conversation in the DoD because the whole classified conversation, right? It was bad enough when when there was a spill and somebody would show up and take my computer off my desk because hey, sorry, and that was a government computer, right? I just went, well, either give me another one or I'm taking a vacation. Whole different story when you show up and go, hey, give me your personal cell phone or give me your personal tablet or give me your personal laptop. That's a concern, right? And that's something that when you're getting into some of those classified environments that I think the DoD is really struggling with. I think the funny thing is, right, there's a sweet spot in there, which is, hey, I'm going to give you a device, but I'm not going to lock it so far down that you can't use it, right? The worst thing I think that I've seen agencies and do is, hey, we're going to be cutting edge, right? It's not cutting edge anymore. We're going to be cutting edge, and we're going to deploy iPhones to everybody. But we're going to lock it so far down, you can't have any apps on it. You can't click on anything, right? All you can do is get email. What's the point?
No Wi-Fi.
Right, yeah. No Wi-Fi. No, you can't do this. You can't do this. You can't do
No
this.
Bluetooth.
Yeah, so you get to a point where I still remember when the DoD had a heart attack because they found out people were using Bluetooth keyboards. And they lost their lunch because they said, oh my goodness gracious, someone's going to intercept that Bluetooth communication inside your secure facility and be able to decipher what key clicks you're making. Well, if they're already inside your secure facility, all they got to do is look over my shoulder while I'm typing. So I think that sometimes these things go to such extremes that it forces people to say, well, I want to use my personal stuff that you're not going to lock down. I think there are safe ways that you can do from a zero trust perspective that you can allow maybe certain access to certain types of information. You have to do that risk acceptance, right? And I'm going to accept the fact that it's different if you get an unclassified email that I'm worried about versus a classified email that I'm worried about, right? So the answer should be, obviously, I'm going to let you access some unclassified stuff on your personal device. I'm certainly not going to let you access classified stuff on your device. And I think the problem is that people get so wrapped around the axle trying to decide all those possible use cases that they either don't want to deal with them and they go, oh, we'll let you do everything on your personal device. Or they go to the other extreme and go, not only are we not going to let you use your personal device, here's a government device that's so locked down that you're just going to want to throw it against the wall because you just can't get anything done with it. It's not easy, right? I don't think that there's a magic solution to all this. I do think that if we don't continue to look for balances in these things, whether it's using a personal device but really controlling what it can access, or using a government-provided device but allowing it to actually be useful, the answer's in there somewhere. But it certainly is not in the way that I think that it's been traditionally approached.
Yeah, I certainly don't think that the solution is to then bring personal devices in the mix. I hate the idea of it. I don't like it. I just think it's going to create more problems, and I think people are going to get, and it's surprising to me how DoD lawyers even let that happen, because honestly, even on the commercial side, if you look at companies, the amount of paperwork you're supposed to sign when you agree to use bring on device solutions, and you pretty much give your life away, or at least your device away, to the company, and people started to complain and be like, well, and people started to sue companies, by the way, when you're like, well, a piece of my device is now used for the company's profit, so you need to pay for my my cell phone plan and the cost of the device at 40% of the device, 60% of the device. Where is the line? There was this whole bunch of nightmares that came to be when that started to take to grow in scale, that even companies start to say, well, maybe we should just give you a device and keep it that way. But for the government lawyers, maybe they don't care about that liability. I don't know. They usually care about so many things, right? And they always come up with reasons to say no. But I was surprised that for once, they should say no, and they're like, just sometimes I was the one to bring up that we should at least have the people agree to sign some type of user agreement for them to even use the service in case of a spill or whatever the case may be. And that wasn't even something they thought about. And honestly, that scares me. It's not the answer. I think the answer is just giving the right devices with the right, options to the warfighter, and just leave it that way. It's just the spillage and even the mistakes, just downloading stuff on a device. And people keep saying, oh, you can't download stuff. That's just not true. there's so many ways you can take a screenshot of it. You can take a picture of the screen. I mean, you can do so many things if you really want to, take the data out of the device. So anyway, I think that was just interesting. So we talk about endpoints, right? We talk about identity. Now, for me, the third pillar has always been the data piece. And, we in the CNAP, we label data down to the cell level, right? So the what could be, secret well, but the who would be TSSCI, right? So we can really, do a good job at, segmenting data at the granular level. What do you think is kind of a good indication of a mature company when it comes to adoption of zero trust when you look at their data security?
Yeah, so I think you touched on it, right? Is getting down and labeling that data at the lowest point that they can get to, right? And I think that's probably one of the biggest oversights that companies make is, they think that, oh, if I stop at the perimeter or I stop at the device and I've solved the identity problem, right now I'm done. And I think that labeling is key, right? I think that one of the things I've really come to be a huge supporter of is this idea of labeling things, right? Labeling applications, labeling environments, labeling data, right? Because then you can write rules on those things, right? I think that so many people just say, oh, it's impossible to label these things. That of course it's possible, right? Of course, if you don't have enough understanding of your data to be able to label it, then you should really question about what data you're collecting. What are you doing with it? Because if you don't have that level of understanding of your data, I think you're being a little remiss in the responsibilities you have to protect that data. So at the end of the day, right, to me, zero trust is getting down to that smallest element that you can possibly get down to. If you can get down inside the data and label that data, that's the win, right? To me, that's really getting down to the smallest fraction of an enterprise that you can get to would be an individual data element. Now I realize that that's a huge ask, right? And that's a huge undertaking. But if you don't start it, you're never going to have any hope of accomplishing it, right? So being able to apply labels, use labels, using those labels, for segmentation, micro segmentation, getting down inside applications, getting down inside of individual, components of an application, and then getting down to those data element layers. That labeling is critical, and I think it's something that is so often overlooked that I think people miss the point of zero trust is about trying to figure out who should have access to what when. But if you're not labeling, I don't know how you can really hope to control that.
Yeah, you probably can't. And it's a journey, but you can also start with the pretty broad labels and then become more and more granular. So it's kind of a good excuse that people use. But when I started to label data in the Air Force and Space Force, I think we went pretty broad, and slowly but surely we're able to go down to the SecRel of Germany stuff, and you can really start pinpointing stuff and start segmenting, of course, through automation, PII, PHI, obviously markings on documents and things like that. It's really not rocket science. I think it used to be harder, but it's getting easier and easier through automation. But then also the most important piece to me was the ability to delegate the decision to the data owners, right? I think that's what the mistake that I keep seeing organizations like DISA do, for example, is they centralize the power, right? They centralize the ability to whitelist or authorize things, and they don't delegate that down to the people doing the work. And for us, it was always important that the data owner was able to, one, create custom labels, and two, assign those labels to user through automation, and three, assign labels to the data, right? And so for that, through policy as code and the ability to give access to simple UIs for the data owners to start labeling data and automating that process. That's been why I think the journey has been less painful, because now you go down to the component level, you go down to the program level, and you're not doing this as the enterprise, behemoth. You're doing it down at the team managing the data, and it's much less work for them if you start spreading that capability across the teams, right? I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I agree, right? I think that a solution that has any chance of success can't just simply rely on four people sitting behind a closed door trying to make all the decisions and do all the work. I think that's insanity, right? I think it's crazy to think that You're not going to involve application owners. You're not going to involve data owners. And ideally, you're going to, like you said, you're going to give them the ability to generate those kinds of labels themselves. You always get, it's funny. You get into the whole, again, this goes back to the pursuit of perfection, right? We got to make sure that we don't have, conflicting labels. Okay, well, sure, but guess what? There's only a finite number of words in the, if you're labeling in English, there's only a finite number of words in the English language. At some point, you're probably gonna have some conflicting labels. But people use that as an excuse, right? We gotta create this massive data dictionary first, so that everybody's playing from the same playbook, so that we don't have any conflicts. That's crazy, right?
I had that at Jesse too. That was the first thing people wanted to do, was spend 5 years on defining words, which, by the way, they would never agree on anyways, and still fight about it to this day, and just fight on the merging of conventions, right, and terms. That's just mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's funny, when I was at the Pentagon on the CIO staff, we were having, and this was 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we were having this conversation. And the favorite example was, well, what's a tank? A tank means something different to the Army than it means to the Air Force, than it might mean to the Marines, than it might mean to the Navy. We're done, right? We can't possibly use the label tank, because none of us can agree on what a tank is, right? And that's the kind of conversations, right? And it's that circular logic that people get themselves wrapped around the axle on. And in the meantime, right, they're not making any progress whatsoever.
Right.
So I think that there are ways that can be worked through to get around that. And people just have
to. The enemy. Perfection is the enemy.
It's the enemy, right? Absolutely.
It's interesting, because the label thing, you look at Google, right? Do you see Google go to websites and tell them to label data or find a way to organize their content? They ingest anything and everything, and they find a way to give you your outcome and your results that you want. We should be the Google. I mean, this is just basic common sense, right? That if Google can do it, right, through technology, the fact is they are not labeling data for their, or mandating specific use of terms or anything like that. They still manage to find every website. Now they even control information now thanks to that, but that's a different problem. But the fact is that's the technology enabled that, right? And it wasn't through manual decisions. It was through technology and innovation. So I use that example with Jesse too, with Google. I'm like, do you see Google telling websites how to label their stuff? They don't do that.
Well, and the key thing is, right, Google accepts the fact that they're going to make mistakes, right? That they are going to mislabel some stuff, and they have that feedback loop to try to correct their own mistakes, right? And the users of Google accept the fact that sometimes they're going to enter a search term and get a link that makes no sense, right? It doesn't happen, it doesn't happen 90% of the time, but the 1 or 2 times that it does happen, they accept it and go, okay, I'll just try to refine my search, or I'll ignore that result, right? And again, Google's not in that, they don't pursue perfection before they deploy anything.
Right.
And I think that's
even now when the algorithm is right and they give you the right results, sometimes they don't like the results and they override them by hand, because they love to control information. But that's a different problem again. So let's talk a little bit about legacy, because everybody, obviously, it's easy to do everything we talked about on modern systems, but obviously the government has pretty old legacy system in pretty much every company. I was talking to companies even like Google that also have 20 years old and 30 years old systems nowadays. So how do you implement zero trust on legacy system? Do you have to just rip and replace, or what's the answer?
No, absolutely not, right? First of all, I'm shocked that you would think that the government doesn't have the most modern systems, Nick. I'm just shocked to hear you say that.
Right.
No, here's a reality, right? And this is where I think that with where I'm working today is one of the things that I'm most proud of, right? Is there are so many people out there that say you have to rip stuff out, right? Hey, I realize that you spent $20 million, $30 million on installing this stuff. Rip it all out and install our stuff, right? Install this new stuff. Sure, right? Wouldn't it be great if you could wave a magic wand, make all the old stuff disappear, put in the brand new, nice, shiny thing of whatever the soup du jour is for today, and deploy it, and everything's off, everything's hunky dory. Let's be real. If you don't have the ability to complement and work with things that are there, right? Work with legacy systems, figure out how to incorporate legacy systems into modern systems, right? From a security standpoint, right? That's insanity, right? That's crazy to think that you're expecting these enterprises to have things deployed that they're just going to magically wave a magic wand and replace. When you look at the size of the federal government, you look at the size of some of the agencies involved, or you look at the size of DoD, right? Hey, we need you to snap your fingers and replace all this widget inside of every plane that you have because we consider it legacy and it's not going to work with our technology, right? That's crazy. So you've got to have the ability to factor in legacy systems, right? And the first thing that's I think the most critical is understanding that the way that you may have to treat a legacy system is different than the way you're going to have to treat a modern system, but you're going to account for those differences, right? So in a lot of instances, the answer is, well, we got a problem with that legacy system because we can't deploy our agent on it, right? Or we don't recognize the language that it's speaking or whatever, right? So there's always some excuse of why someone's trying to tell you to replace a legacy system. Honestly, the answer is, you move up to a point where you can control it, you can see it, you can deal with it, right? And then make that your enclave, your small enclave. So you may not have gotten that zero trust down to that individual item, and you may have a little enclave here of some legacy systems that maybe aren't as secure as the more modern parts of your enterprise. But some security is better than none, right? And so many people want to ignore the legacy systems or tell you to rip and replace it. Finding that sweet spot where you say, hey, I'm going to apply security around those legacy systems, right? And I'm going to control information that's flowing from those legacy systems to my more modern systems that I have much more security deployed on, and vice versa from those modern systems into those legacy systems, right? That's the balance that is so critical. And I think that so many companies sometimes want to skip that step. And their answer is, well, we've got the perfect solution, so you need to adapt your entire enterprise to our solution. If you're talking to a vendor that tells you that, I would strongly suggest you go talk to another vendor.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's so effectively it's kind of putting a wrapper around the legacy and maybe what you see some people do with a basic proxy, but there's also more advanced capabilities now, particularly when it comes to data centricity, that's going to be able to query maybe the database in your legacy system, for example, and then bring back the data and then filter it on demand. So then you can do that data centricity labeling. Let's say the system does not support labeling. You can kind of add it as an added layer separate from the legacy, so you don't have to change the legacy stack. So that there are different ways to do different things, but definitely ability to add this as a wrapper around an existing stack and use that as the only access point to that system now, and flow that through that capability to filter access to the legacy. So definitely something you can do. So
yeah, and it's funny, right? A lot of times with legacy systems, people get fixated on all of the IPs of all the legacy systems, right? There are ways that you can like you said, right? There are ways that you can still label those legacy systems without necessarily putting the label directly applied to the device. But like you said, right? More of a centralized collection point maybe for some of those legacy systems and label it there, as opposed to getting overwhelmed by the fact that I've got thousands and thousands of legacy systems out there that I don't have a label directly applied to. I think some people just they get their own way when they think about some of these legacy systems. And again, anybody that tells you rip and replace, I would run in the opposite direction as fast as I could.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, part of the perfection is enemy discussion, because I think they want to get to the same level of security as zero trust, and it's probably impossible with some of the legacy systems. So you're gonna have some concessions you're gonna make with a proxy slash wrapper implementation, but at least it's better than nothing, and it's certainly something better than what they have, right? So
absolutely.
So I guess the other piece is we talk about a lot of IT systems, but we didn't really address kind of the OT side of the house. So can you do zero trust on OT systems, or is it just a dream?
No, you can absolutely do zero trust on OT systems. Now, again, right, sometimes the answer is exactly what we just talked about, very similar to the legacy systems, right? Maybe you can't apply an agent or a sensor or a label directly to that end device, right? Maybe it's just hey, it's a small camera, right? It's a web-based camera. It's a sensor. It's an arc welder, right? For building industrial machinery or something. and you can't apply something directly onto it, right? But you can certainly go to a collection point, right, or a series of collection points, and interface with those, those OT devices and those IoT devices at that level, right? Back to, again, it doesn't have to be, perfect, but good enough, right? So you can certainly apply zero trust and labeling to OT devices, IoT devices, that while you may not necessarily be able to write directly to that device and directly control that individual device, you can certainly do it at collection levels where you can at least decide this is how this interfaces with the rest of my enterprise, or because it's going through two different collection points, I can segment off those two different segments of OT from each other, right? Because I can do zero trust at those collection levels. And I think that a lot of people just miss that concept because they think it's an all or nothing, right? And they're not willing to do a graduated, gradual kind of systematic approach to trying to figure out, okay, what's good enough, right? What's the, like you just said, some level of security is certainly better than none. So many people just kind of write those things off and say, well, I'm not going to worry about them. Nick, I can tell you that I was involved in a situation where some folks bought some surveillance cameras, plugged them into the network, and there was malware embedded on the operating system of those cameras. So if you don't do something, those are the types of vulnerabilities that you're opening yourself up to. And so many people ignore the threats that can come from OT and IoT devices that if you don't do something, you're just opening yourself up. So of course you can apply zero trust. Again, not down to the individual device per se, but at those collection points, you can certainly label and then write rules that allow traffic or don't allow traffic.
So it's kind of the same principle as the legacy system, effectively, right? It's just a
absolutely
type of, yeah.
It's funny, right? It's the same principle, just opposite ends of the spectrum, right? So often your OT and your IoT devices are some of your newest cutting edge things, as opposed to the legacy devices on the opposite end of that spectrum. But I think the approach that you can take with both of them are very, very similar.
Yeah, no doubt. So have you seen obviously with this adoption of zero trust, have you seen, malicious actor change their behavior or change the way they attack systems now that, some of these companies are embracing zero trust?
So I would love to say the answer is, yes, that they've been forced to change the way that they're attacking. The problem is so many people don't have zero trust deployed.
It's not there enough yet and mature enough.
Yeah, they can continue to make money and get what they want without having to change anything, right? There are so many targets of opportunity out there that they don't necessarily have to change the way that they're approaching things, right? They can just go after the softer targets and continue to pursue. I think the real message there is how, when you deploy zero trust inside of an environment, especially from my perspective, when you get into segmentation and micro-segmentation, how you can, number one, make yourself a very unattractive target. How it is, right? Most of these malicious actors, now look, right, there are some malicious actors that are very targeted in their, what they're going after. The majority of the malicious actors that people deal with they're looking for money. They're looking to scrape and steal data that they can then turn around and sell for money.
Easy targets, right?
So they're going after the easy targets, right? So you cause them the least bit of grief, the least bit of headaches, right? They've gone through their bag of tricks, and all of a sudden they still have no way of getting through and getting to the data that they want to get to. They're going to move on to somebody else. They're not necessarily going to spend a whole lot of time and energy trying to crack through your zero trust defenses if they know that there's 90+% of agencies out there that don't have zero trust deployed. I'll just go focus my efforts on them instead, and recoup my investment and write that one off as a loss and just move on to the next target. So I wish I could say that organizations are able to say, we're forcing the bad actors to change their methods. Until zero trust really gets more deployed, they're just going to move on to softer targets. There was a study out from the Enterprise Strategy Group that said last year 76% of organizations experienced some sort of ransomware attack. That's a huge number, right? So if you happen to be in that 24% that didn't experience it, and that's because you deployed zero trust, good for you. That's still a huge target base for the adversaries out there.
I know that. So I guess, what organization have you seen that are leading in the adoption of zero trust, particularly in the government? I guess Who do you feel like is kind of leading the torch of zero trust nowadays?
All right, so people are going to assume that this was a setup or that I'm trying to kiss up to you, but the Air Force and Space Force are
It is a setup,
very much
right? I mean,
fit.
let's face
So,
it.
but here's the reality, right? I mean, to the point that you talked about with CNAP, right? The Air Force and Space Force, right, have really got to a point where they've got a implementable solution, right? And they're making great strides in deploying those solutions. When you look at inside a government, there are other agencies that are doing very well for themselves as they look to figure out how to deploy zero trust, right? And at various levels of zero trust.
So who is number two, I guess, since it's, people are going to think you're biased on number one, which I don't think you are. Obviously, I'm biased, so I'm going to agree with you anyways. But what is number two?
And as a reminder, right, 20 years in the Air Force, I'm going to be a little biased. Whether you were here or not, Nick, I'd be a little biased after 20 years wearing the blue, right? So
yeah, there's double bias there.
I've got a double bias, right? And my bias is very deeply rooted. So without getting into specifics, I've seen some of the intelligence-oriented agencies are really starting to make some strides in trying to ensure that they're looking at creative ways of protecting what they have and the things that they need to protect. And some of the smaller federal agencies. It's funny, we talked about OIGs, right? It's interesting that there are some OIGs out there that are taking zero trust very seriously. And partially it's because of the amount of things that they collect when they're looking at, investigating other federal agencies or trying to audit other federal agencies. They take their mission very seriously. So there are some of the IGs out there that are getting, very specific about their approach to zero trust. Trying to be very careful about naming names because that gets you in trouble. But there are definitely pockets inside the federal government that have gotten very serious about zero trust and are making great strides in that arena. So, and again, some of them, there are other entities that I know with you, it's a 4-letter word. They're trying, right? They're saying the right things. They're doing their best. But like I said, I think
all I care is tangible outcomes. That's all I care about. I don't care people that try. I'm done with participation trophies. Okay, so I know people love it, but I live in a world where, and I'm sure you did too, but where life or death is real, and we just don't have the chance to play with things, and we just need outcomes. But
yeah, I will tell you that, right? One thing that I think that the government has really been paying attention to is the success that things like the banking industry has had with zero trust. The banking industry has been doing zero trust for almost a decade, and very successfully. And they've got obviously, right, a very heavy investment into protecting their enterprises and protecting their data. So I think that the federal government has really started to take notice of what the banking industry has been doing, and is really starting to realize that, hey, there are people that are dealing with other people's money, which is one of the most sacred things that you can be entrusted with. So maybe we should take maybe take a page out of their book a little bit.
There's only one that's more important, is when the warfighter trusts us for their safety and their lives, and I think that's something that's even more scary. But
absolutely.
And I think people sometimes forget that a little bit. I think when we start thinking of people like cattle and not people, that's a little bit scary. But anyway, question from the public here. I think that's a good question. I think I know the answer, but I'm going to let you see if you have a different answer. Do you know if there's a list of hardware software allowed to be used at home for the personnel that's allowed to be consumed, like hardware of routers and, things?
Yeah. So I know that, for, and I guess the answer is it depends, right, on what you're trying to do, right? What level of information you're dealing with.
I think it's for on-class work.
Right. Yeah. So I know that there are lists that DISA maintains that talks about devices that are approved for classified processing versus unclassified processing. For the federal government, there's really not a centralized list per se. It's a lot of times it gets down to sometimes category devices, but at the end of the day, in the federal government, that comes down to individual agencies and their accrediting authorities and what they will and won't allow. So there's certainly no blanket answer to, well, if I go buy this, then I know I'm going to be able to use it, wherever I want to use it. That doesn't exist to my knowledge.
Yeah, and if the list existed, it would be devices from 1997. So I don't know if
Probably.
you want to buy, it anyways. So I think it does. I think it doesn't exist. And I mean, there's some list of banned things, right? And even that list is so hard to find that most people don't know it exists.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing is, this is so hidden that even if it did exist, it's not widely accessible enough. And I see people buying. Particularly during COVID, we had people buying smart card readers, right, on Amazon, made in China, so I've seen it all. So, we didn't have enough readers to give to the personnel anyways. No one thought of the fact that we were mandating CAC cards would require people to have a CAC reader. It's a little
I was on air staff when we made that switch. So no, I'm trusting.
I love, by the way, it's funny because I actually love the CAC. I think it's actually the best option there is because it's a physical thing. It opens the door. It does a lot of things. I'm not and with the right credential on mobile, I think it's just great. I just don't have any problem with it, but I actually like it a lot. Particularly when you have to enter buildings and get into rooms and things. I just think it's just. I mean, I get the fact that you can forget it and stuff, but I have my UB keys, so I can forget it too. But
yeah. Well, Nick, I will tell you,
I like.
It was a bit of a challenge when the military started using CAC cards. And, it's one thing to forget it and go, oh, how am I going to get back in the building? It's another thing when you go off base to go to lunch and you can't even get back on your military base because your ID card's sitting on your desk or in your computer somewhere. So,
yeah. That's always, that's always going to be a problem. But I go find a better way to solve building access and like device access and network access. Is just
I think the lesson there
is it's an idea to travel and fly, right? I mean, it's just like it's checking so many boxes. I don't know how you replace that.
I tell you only do that one time and you make sure you never do it again. So
that's a lesson you learn pretty hard, right?
That's a lesson you learn quick.
I mean, most people send someone to go get it, but I don't know if that shouldn't be allowed. I assume, but that's what people do, I think. But anyway, I've seen it before, right? So other question, right? So I guess Sibila was asking a question about people using desktop anywhere. It's obviously giving you a VDI access to Nipper if you don't know what it is. So obviously people then use their home device, bring on device, and they're using their home connection, right, to connect to desktop anywhere. Obviously the connection is encrypted, so I'm not sure what's visible on the network on that, but I mean, people could probably see at least that you're talking to desktop anywhere. But if the router has some type of endpoint protection or IPS pushing logs to the cloud, could that cause an issue or not?
Yeah, sure. I think I think that's the points out one of the biggest fallacies of if you're trying to trust the network transport. There's always going to be flaws with just trying to trust network transport, right? I think that's where zero trust, when you really get into, whether in this case it's your home desktop or laptop, or it's the application that you're trying to access, right? And breaking that security layer away from the network transport layer. I think that's where you really get into the true benefits of zero trust. Because that this is a complicated situation. But it's just as complicated saying, oh, I've got a network in one cloud and a network in another cloud, and in two different data centers, and half of it's virtualized and half of it's physical. Putting a lot of eggs in the transport layer, the network layer of from a security standpoint, I think is such the wrong way to approach this.
Oh yeah, it should be. I mean, you should be fine using a dirty transport. In fact, we do it all the time. In fact, we do it. This is what we do.
And let's be real, right? If you're using your home internet, right, and depending on what internet you're using, right, you're on a compromised network.
It is a dirty network. That's what it is, right? At some point, people, I hear all these nations, right, struggling with governance and the fact that the clouds are coming from sovereignty of the data, right? That France, for example, is complaining that they don't want to trust Microsoft or Amazon because it's American, bad Americans, So then they want to create their own clouds, but they're 20 years behind, and it's like, yeah, you're not going to make it, and you're going to be obsolete by the time you try to do that. The better answer is to effectively be agnostic where you're running and not care if it's dirty or not. And that's a harder thing to do, but it's much better investment. In fact, when you've seen the DoD, right, and the IC spend 10 billion on trying to do a GovCloud enclave, and Amazon could not keep parity between the commercial region and the government regions, and you're often lagging 2 years behind despite spending 10 billion. You imagine that's a fifth of the French MOD budget, right there. So, it's for most companies, organizations, you have no choice but to find a way to do it on dirty transport and, potentially clouds. So that's what it is. So,
no, absolutely.
But, she was mentioning, of course, you could use DNA or whatever, retina scans. I don't like it. And why I don't like it is because if that get hacked and that data get leaked, you don't have another eye, right? Or you don't have another fingerprint. And that happened actually already. And now you're done. And then there's nothing else you could do. So I don't see how we could end up using that as a solution, because that data is going to get leaked and then you're done. So
no, absolutely. Yeah. You've got a PIV card, you got a YubiKey. I can go get another one, right? I can update my security. I can change it.
Or you can put a how do you call it? On your eyes.
The contact lens.
Contact lens, and then maybe that gives you a different thing. But I don't know. And then you have also augmented reality thing, and you can see, through walls. I don't know.
Yeah.
but until that is, that I don't think that's the answer. Particularly when you know how well that data is secure. I just don't see it. A CAC, you can just get a new one, right? So I'm with you on that. Same for the certs, right?
Yep.
So wanted to thank you. That was the last. You have so many more questions, but we already 15 minutes over, so I'm not going to abuse of your time. But I always give the last words right to the guests, so I'm going to give that to you in a second. Before that, I just want to remind everybody of the next guest next week. Next Tuesday, we're going to have Jay Bonchi, the Air Force Space Force CTO, come back on the show after 1 year to give us a little bit of an update on what he's been able to achieve and what his journey has been so far, coming from the commercial side into the government, what are the successes or the challenges he's been facing, or even the failures he has seen in 1 year. So it's going to be an interesting discussion. And Jay Bonchi is going to join us next Tuesday, the 1st at 1 p.m. Eastern. So don't miss it. It's going to be fun. But I wanted to thank you, Gary, for all this knowledge and all this time and all this information you share with us. I think, we debunked Zero Trust today. We're able to show what it really is, but also what are the things to pay attention to between identity, data, and endpoints, and all the work that you guys do. Of course, people have seen that Illumio is providing great solutions, so people can go check it out. I remind everybody that no one is sponsoring this show and no one is making me say things I don't want to say. So there is no financial engagement whatsoever for people to come on the show. So, we get a lot of different guests with a lot of different perspectives to share with us their thoughts. So we're lucky to have Gary today, and over to you for the last words.
Thanks, Nick. I appreciate you having me on the show. It's been fantastic. I'm a big fan of the show. I think that the last thing I want to tell everyone is, if I can leave you with one thing, it's this. Start your Zero Trust journey. If you haven't started it, you've got to get started. Don't wait, and stop worrying about the pursuit of perfection. Pick a path and get started. I would urge you, and strongly urge you, look at what you've already got in place. If you've already got a decent perimeter security in place, you've got decent identity in place, maybe it's time to move on to something different. Look internal. Ask yourself, what happens when your network gets breached? Because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So ask yourself, what are you doing to stop that lateral movement inside your enterprise? What are you doing to stop an adversary from getting access to data inside your enterprise once they gain that breach, once that breach is successful? Because again, it is not a matter of if they're going to be successful, it's going to be a matter of when. So I encourage you, if you have not taken a look at inside your enterprise and you've not asked yourself, how would I stop someone, whether it's somebody I know or somebody I don't know, from doing malicious things inside my enterprise? You need to seriously consider spending your money and looking at a solution that's going to help you stop that inside movement from that attacker. So with that, Nick, I appreciate your time. Thank you again so much for having me. It's been fantastic.
Thanks so much. And everybody, see you next Tuesday, 1 p.m. with Jay Bonchi. In the meantime, keep fighting the good fight to make sure our kids have a fighting chance at winning against China 20 years from now. Stay safe, everybody. Bye bye.